News of the Times, the Dundry Hill murder, the Wedmore brothers, and the death of Sarah Waterman in 1861. Welcome to News of the Times. In 1861, the quiet village of Dundry Hill near Bristol was shaken by one of the most brutal crimes of the Victorian age. Two brothers, Charles and Matthew Wedmore, plotted together to rob their elderly aunt and uncle, George and Sarah Waterman, in their isolated cottage on a winter's night. Posing as a local policeman, they gained entry to the couple's home. What followed was a scene of shocking savagery, both brothers armed with bludgeons, the uncle beaten nearly senseless, and the aunt struck down with such force that her skull was fractured almost entirely around its base. It was a crime that appalled even hardened Victorians, the cruelty of it and the betrayal within a family. The Wedmore brothers' joint descent into violence, their drunken spree after the murder, and their eventual execution at Taunton drew thousands of spectators and left an enduring stain on the history of Somerset. And in today's further particulars, a devil in white leaping through the night with a candle in a turnip and a cry of chick, chick. In 1867, Broughty Ferry terror had a new name, and one man met it with a flower pot. So, lock your doors, draw the curtains tight, and pour yourself something warming. We've got betrayal, brutality, and a leaping turnip demon on the loose. This is Victorian crime at its most gothic. Get comfortable and let's begin. We begin in the winter of 1861 on the steep, quiet slopes of Dundry Hill near Bristol. In a small but tidy cottage nestled just below the roadside, George and Sarah Waterman, aged 75 and 73, lived a modest, comfortable life. Married for decades, known in the village as the decent, unassuming souls, they kept a cow, tended their orchard, and managed an acre of land. George, a veteran of Salamanca and a pensioner of Her Majesty's 9th Regiment, still delivered milk by hand from the hillside. Their home was isolated, some 200 yards from the nearest neighbour, and its roof nearly level to the road above. And recently George had sold a property receiving nearly £40 in cash, approximate value of £6,000 in 2025, enough perhaps to tempt the wrong kind of attention. And on one cold January night, it did. From the Bristol Mercury, the 21st of January, 1861, the diabolical murder and robbery at Dundry. Intelligence reached this city at an early hour on Thursday morning that an aged couple residing in the above usually quiet village had been brutally attacked by two men who gained ingress to their cottage by means of a ruse, and some one of the objects of their murderous assault had, within a few hours of the attack, died from the injuries received at the hands of her cold-blooded assassins. It appears that in a small cottage about 200 yards from Dundry Church resided an old man and his wife named George and Sarah Waterman, aged respectively 75 and 73. They were well known in the village as a quiet, unoffending persons, and the cottage in which they resided together with an acre of land was their own property. Mr. Waterman gained a livelihood as a milkman, keeping one cow and also farming a small quantity of ground. At about 7 o'clock on the evening of Wednesday, Mr. Waterman and his wife were sitting by the fire in their kitchen when some person knocked at the door of their cottage. Mr. Waterman at once got up and went to the door, but before opening it he inquired who was there, as was, we believe, his custom. The person on the outside replied, "It is John, the Winfield policeman." And he, Mr. Waterman, knowing the constable referred to, at once unfastened the door and opened it. He immediately received a heavy blow upon the forehead, which was inflicted with a thick, heavy stick. He ran back into the kitchen and was followed by two men, one of whom knocked him down and struck him several heavy blows upon the head. The old man got up, and the villains then told him that he must go upstairs and show them where his money was. They forced him violently up the stairs before them, and on getting into the bedroom again asked him where his money was. The old man replied that it was in his box, and the murderers, having taken from the box that was pointed out a sum of 5 shillings or 6 shillings, proceeded to break open and ransack other boxes and a chest of drawers that were in the room. From these they took a silver watch, a silver medal, and a bottle of brandy, some home-made wine, and a silk handkerchief. No doubt they were disappointed in not finding a greater sum of money, and they turned over the bed in the hopes of probably finding some money secreted there, when a couple of loaded pistols were revealed to their sight. These weapons the ruffians possessed themselves of, and going downstairs again, compelling Mr. Waterman to accompany them, they helped themselves to a loaf and some bacon, which they cut from the side and packed up in a handkerchief. They then asked the old man for a cord, and he gave them a hay rope, upon which they forced him into the milk house, which adjoined the kitchen, or rather is only separated from it by a slight partition, and they bound him with the cord he had given them to the leg of a bacon stand, on which were the couple of sides of bacon. They here left him, telling him he must remain there for 20 minutes, when he might call his wife to let him loose. The old man, although exceedingly weak from the loss of blood and from the inhuman attack of which he had been the object, managed to free himself from his bondage, and, on going into the house, he saw his wife lying upon the floor in the middle of the kitchen, quite insensible. He tried to lift her up, but failing in doing so, he left the cottage and went to the house of a butcher named William Lovell, about 200 or 300 yards distant. Lovell returned with the old man, who was so weak that he was obliged to assist him the whole way, and the first thing that met his view on entering the cottage was Mrs. Waterman stretched upon the floor of the kitchen, bleeding profusely from several serious wounds in her head. Mr. Lovell immediately sought other assistance, and the old lady was carried up to bed. A messenger was dispatched for Mr. Shorland, surgeon of Winford, who arrived in a short time and proceeded to dress the wounds in the head of the injured woman, which were of a ghastly description, it being aptly described by a female who was present attending on her that her head was beaten to a mummy. Sarah Waterman died at 9:30, without ever regaining consciousness. Just 1 week earlier, a chance encounter had unknowingly set the crime in motion. John Keevil, a former Winford police constable now working as a stableman in Dundry, testified that Charles Wedmore had visited him under the guise of seeking his uncle George. Keevil, unaware of any sinister intent, agreed to show him the way. When they arrived at the cottage, Mrs. Waterman called through the door, "Who is there?" And Keevil replied, "It is John, the old policeman," to which she answered, I know your voice, or I shouldn't open the door." It was this exact exchange, heard and remembered by Charles Wedmore, that the brothers would later use to gain entry to the home on the night of the attack. With Sarah Waterman now dead and her husband grievously wounded, attention turned to locating the attackers. George Waterman's injuries were extensive. His skull bore several deep wounds, some 4 to 5 inches long, and his right hand was not only beaten but badly burned from contact with the kitchen grate. It was feared that he might not live long enough to speak. A decision was made to take his testimony at once. From the Bristol Mercury, the 12th of January 1861, the diabolical murder and robbery at Dundry. The old man's hurts are of a very serious character, his skull being wounded in several places, some of the indentures being 4 to 5 inches in length, while his right hand is seriously injured by blows from the murderous weapons of the assailants, as well as being burnt through having come into contact with the fire in the grate as he fell. The surgeon having intimated to the police authorities that he considered the injured man in a very dangerous state, and the possibilities being that he would not recover, they communicated with H. J. Mordaunt, Esquire, one of the justices of the county of Somerset, residing at Ashton Water, with a view to his deposition being taken. Accordingly, at about middle of yesterday, Mr. Mordaunt attended at the bedside of Mr. Waterman, and the following deposition was taken. Mr. John Shorland deposed, "I am a surgeon living at Dundry. It is my opinion that George Waterman is in a very dangerous state from blows on the head, producing extensive lacerated wounds, and that he may not be able to give evidence at any future time. He is perfectly sensible now." George Waterman then deposed, "I am aware that I am dangerously ill and that I may not recover. At about 7 o'clock on the evening of the 9th of January, somebody knocked at my door, and I asked who it was, and he answered that it was John, the Winfield policeman. I opened the door, and someone struck me on the forehead with a large stick." George chillingly recounts the tragic events of that fateful day. 2 men pushed into the cottage. George ran into the kitchen, but was followed, knocked down, and struck again and again. He was forced upstairs, showed his boxes, and watched helplessly as they took his 5 shillings silver watch, his Waterloo medal, and a bottle of homemade wine. "They asked me for a cord, and I gave them one," he said. "The shorter of the 2 tied my hands behind me and bound me to the bacon stand in the milk house." George pleaded for his wife. One of the men answered chillingly, "I've put her to sleep." Somehow, George managed to free himself, crawling, bleeding from the house to find help. "When I got back," he said, "I saw my wife lying on the kitchen floor on her right side. She was quite insensible. He couldn't lift her. I was bleeding freely from the head," he said, "but I got Mr. Lovell's 300 yards away, and he helped me home." Despite his condition, George was determined to help identify the attackers. He told the magistrate he believed he would recognise the shorter man, a young fellow with hair under his chin, of about 35 years of age. The taller one had a thin, pale face and wore what George described as a shooting jacket with large inside pockets. The pistols, the sticks, and even the looted silver watch last seen by George just before 6 that evening were all now missing. The cottage itself was modest but neat, and bore the marks of a quiet, orderly life in the milk house adjoining the kitchen. George had been tied with hay rope to the leg of a bacon stand, and when a reporter visited the scene later that week, the rope was still there, looped and stained. The kitchen floor, once warm with firelight, now held a dark pool of dried blood. Outside on the frozen path, splashes marked where George had stumbled through the snow, bleeding from his head in search of help. He and Sarah had lived there alone for over 30 years. From the Bristol Mercury, the 12th of January 1861, the diabolical murder and robbery at Dundry. Investigation and capture. The police of the county of Somerset lost no time in prosecuting the most praiseworthy inquiries with a view to the arrest of the murderers. Handbills giving a description of the suspected parties were prepared, and Mr. Superintendent Jones put himself in early communication with the constabulary of this city. It is gratifying to know that on Thursday evening both men were apprehended in the Hotwell Road after a resolute resistance by two of our most active detective officers, PCs Perrot and Hughes. A minute description of the supposed murderers was given to the whole of the police force upon going on duty on Thursday, and Police Constable Perrot and Hughes, with other detectives, at once made the most searching inquiries with a view to their apprehension. It was soon discovered that as early as 8:30 in the morning, two men answering the description of the accused went into the Inkerman Tavern, St. John's Bridge and Christmas Street, and there remained until 10 o'clock. They said they had been walking all night, and each produced a watch which they offered for sale to Mr. Miles, the landlord, who declined to purchase them. On leaving the house, a pistol was observed protruding from the pocket of one of them. By means of this information, Mr. Miles lost no time in communicating to the police authorities in consequence of having read the report of the murder in the Daily Post. They were traced from the Inkerman Tavern to a beer house of a low character in Tower Lane called Thetis Frigate. While at this house, they gave a watch to a girl named Gullick to go out and pawn, which she did at the shop of Mr. Jacobs, pawnbroker, at Broadsmead, and returned with 10 shillings which she had got upon it, and which she gave to the prisoners, and after remaining there till 1 o'clock in the morning, they left particularly intoxicated. The landlord, hearing of the murder, subsequently gave information to the police, and on inquiries being instituted, the woman redeemed the watch and handed it to M.C. Calcott. The watch, answering the description of the one of those which had been stolen at the time of the murder, at once assured the police that they were upon the track of the supposed murderers, and Hughes and Perrot went to the Inkerman Tavern and gleaned from the landlord a minute description of the men who had visited his house in the morning. Acting swiftly on new intelligence, the police tracked the Wedmore brothers to Hotwell Road, where they were believed to be visiting a sister. Officers lay in wait, joined by Superintendent Jones of Ashton and Sergeant Morse of Dundry, watching the street into the evening, and at about 7 o'clock the brothers appeared. Sergeant Morse approached George Wedmore only to have a pistol suddenly raised and fired directly at his head. The bullet missed him by inches. Morse later said he could feel it whistle past his ear. In the chaos, Matthew Wedmore bolted. Bystanders tackled him to the ground as someone cried out, "For God's sake, look out! He's got a pistol!" He did, one of the very weapons stolen from his uncle's cottage. It was still loaded and capped, and after a struggle, both brothers were finally subdued and taken to Clifton Police Station. Charles and Matthew Wedmore. They are both of them strong, muscular men, one particularly, and it has been ascertained that they have been recently living with a married sister named Hill, who resides in Jones's Court, Hotwell Road. It was known to the police that one of these prisoners was in the habit of visiting her, and upon instituting inquiries they were induced to search her house, and there found some bread, cheese and bacon, but she stated she had brought them into the house. But from the minute descriptions given of the stolen things from the house of Mr. Waterman, there is every reason to believe that it formed part of the produce of the robbery. On the prisoners being searched at the police station, upon one of them was found a canvas bag purse, which is also believed by the police officers to have been stolen at the same time. Too much praise cannot be awarded to the officers who have just been instrumental in arresting two such daring murderers, and no one, we are sure, will think them the less entitled to remuneration because they have apprehended the men prior to the offering of a public reward. Back in custody, the case took a darker turn. Faced with the weight of evidence and perhaps the grim certainty of the gallows, both brothers turned to confession of assault. Each placed the most savage aspects of the crime, including the fatal blows to Sarah Waterman, squarely on the shoulders of the other. But between their contradictory admissions, the stolen items found in their possession, and the testimony of several witnesses, not least the now somewhat recovered George Waterman, the Crown felt its case was strong. And so, 2 months after the murder, the case came to trial. From the Bristol Mercury, the 23rd of March 1861, Somerset Spring Assizes, the Dundry murder. Matthew Wedmore, 31, and Charles Wedmore, 28, were indicted and charged on the coroner's inquisition with the wilful murder of Sarah Waterman at Dundry on the 9th of January last. The prisoners both pleaded not guilty. Mr. Cole, in stating the case to the jury, said he appeared with his learned friend Mr. Beer to conduct the case for the prosecution. Mr. Cole observed that he considered he should be best discharging his duty if he contented himself at that time with laying before them the facts of the case. The charge was that on the 9th of January last, the two prisoners at the bar murdered an old woman of the name of Waterman. The deceased was an aged woman living with her husband in a small cottage by the Dundry Hill. The deceased was 73 years of age, and her husband was about the same age, and was a Chelsea pensioner, and they had lived together very comfortably for some time. The prisoners at the bar, who were brothers, were nephews of the poor old man. The taller prisoner, he understood, had been a private in the Royal Marines, but at this time in question was at home on furlough, his friends living in Bristol. Of the shorter prisoner, Matthew, antecedents he knew nothing, but that he worked upon the quays at Bristol. The scene of the murder was rather a retired spot, being a cottage by the side of the hill, with a path descending to it from the road, which was nearly level with the roof, and being 300 yards from any other house, was in a very solitary position. The old man was considered in the neighbourhood to be a thrifty person. He had a small orchard and a cow, and lived on his pension and the produce of his garden. It was believed he had some little property, and he was considered to have saved some money. That was not an unimportant fact. At about 7 o'clock that evening, some person knocked at the door of the cottage, and the deceased was at that time sitting by the side of the fire in perfectly good health and engaged in the knitting. That was the last time the poor old woman was seen in a conscious state. The old man heard a knock at the door and he said, "Who's there?" And then came an answer which was very important for them to consider. The answer was, "It is the policeman, Winford John." He should show them that there had been a Winford policeman, a man named Keevil, who was intimate with the old people and was in the habit of going and sitting with them. He should also be shown that some few days previously, at about the 1st of January, Charles Wedmore was at Dundry. One of the most telling witnesses was John Keevil, formerly a policeman at Winford, now employed as a stable hand by the local clergyman. He recalled that George Wedmore had approached him days before the murder, asking about his uncle, George Waterman. During their chat, Keevil mentioned, perhaps unwisely, that Wedmore's brother had recently purchased a house from the old man, suggesting he might have money on the premises. Keevil then accompanied Charles to the Waterman's cottage. The gate was locked, and when Sarah Waterman asked who was there, Keevil replied, "It is John, the police of Winford." She recognised his voice and let them in. A detail chilling in hindsight, as it was the exact phrase later used by the assailants on the night of the attack. Charles and Keevil stayed a while, chatted politely with the old woman and left, but by then the groundwork had already been laid. That evening, the ruse of being John, the police of Winford, was used by the prisoners. In court, the prosecution reiterated the brutal sequence of events: the forced entry under false pretences, the savage beating of George Waterman, and the violent death of his wife, Sarah. Much of the testimony echoed what had already been heard: the vicious blows with sticks later found in the cottage, the ransacking of the upstairs bedroom, and the chilling moment when one of the brothers, responding to a plea for mercy, coldly said, "I have put her to sleep." Blood pooled on the kitchen floor. A pair of bloodied tongs, tangled with grey hair, lay nearby, silent witness to Sarah's desperate attempts to fight back. In court, Mr. Shorland, the attending surgeon, gave his medical account of the injuries sustained by Sarah Waterman. He found her shortly before 9 o'clock in a state of complete insensibility. She never spoke again, never regained awareness, and died within 2 hours. A post-mortem revealed the full horror of her wounds: a fracture to the skull measuring some 14 inches, along extensive blunt force traumas. There was no question as to the cause of death. Suspicion had fallen quickly upon the prisoners at the bar, Charles and Matthew Wedmore, and the police, acting on various witness accounts, wasted no time in following the trail to Bristol. Their arrest, dramatic as it was, brought with the recovery of several stolen items, tying the pair directly to the crime. Mr. Cole, for the prosecution, noted that George Waterman, who for weeks had hovered near death, had since recovered enough to appear in court and offer his testimony. He also remarked that both prisoners had, at different times while in custody, attempted to make statements to police officials. Closing his remarks, Mr. Cole reminded the jury that under the law both men bore equal responsibility for the crime, whether it was one brother who struck the fatal blow or the other. The evidence, he declared, was not only compelling but conclusive. George Waterman, now mostly recovered from the brutal assault and still grieving the loss of his wife of 30 years, testified calmly and clearly. He recounted how, deceived by a familiar voice at the door, he was set upon by his own nephews, Matthew and Charles Wedmore, beaten, robbed and tied up, and he pleaded for mercy for his wife. Their reply was, "I've put her to sleep." When he broke free, Sarah lay bleeding and insensible. She never spoke again. William Lovell of Dundry deposed, "I live about 150 yards from the Waterman's cottage. Mine is the nearest house to his. Saw Mrs. Waterman arise on the Thursday previous to the murder. On the evening of the 9th, George Waterman came to my house. He had a handkerchief to his head and was covered with blood. I led him back to his cottage and went there before him. I found Mrs. Waterman lying on the floor with her face and hands covered with blood, and blood all over the floor. She was alive but couldn't speak. There was a strong set of tongs lying near. I lifted up the face. She squeezed my hand but could not speak. I went to give information to the police, and Mr. Shorland, surgeon, was sent for. I had been at the Dundry Inn that evening and saw the prisoners there together. They left a little before I did. I left at 7 and went straight home. The distance from the inn to my cottage is about 250 or 300 yards. Mr. Shorland, the village surgeon, was called to the scene just before 9 p.m. He found George Waterman bloodied but conscious, and Mrs. Waterman still alive, although only just. She was slumped in a chair, her clothes soaked throughout with blood. A swelling bulged on her forehead, and she could not swallow even the smallest dose of stimulant. Within half an hour, she was dead. The post-mortem was brutal in its findings. Mrs. Waterman had 2 massive contused wounds and a swelling at the back of the skull. Beneath it lay an indentation and a fracture that ran nearly the entire circumference of the skull, extending to 12 to 14 inches in multiple directions. Her skull was in effect shattered. According to Mr. Shorland, such injuries could only be caused by repeated and extreme force, entirely consistent with the iron tongs and heavy bludgeons recovered from the scene. He further noted that George Waterman bore 6 scalp wounds, some more severe in appearance than those inflicted on his wife. These too were in keeping with the blunt instrument attack. Under cross-examination, the defence suggested that some of Mrs. Waterman's wounds might have come from a fall against the fender. Mr. Shorland dismissed this. The pattern of trauma, he insisted, showed no doubt. This was not the result of a fall. This was sustained, violent assault. Charles Wedmore, perhaps seeing the weight of evidence piling up against them, requested to make a formal statement whilst in custody. In it, he admitted to entering the Waterman's cottage with his brother Matthew and confirmed that they used the false identity of John the Winford policeman to gain entry. Once inside, it was in Charles telling Matthew who struck first and struck the hardest. Charles confessed to joining in the beating, admitting that he too had struck George Waterman with a short stick. But when it came to Sarah, he shifted the full blame onto his brother. My brother saw her and went and struck her, and I said, I will kill you. I said, do not kill her. The rest reads like a grim household inventory. Watches, a loaf of bread, a piece of bacon, a bottle of brandy, and a piece of cheese. As if they were not just robbing their own uncle and aunt, but also making up a picnic on their way out. Charles finished his confession by describing how Matthew tied up their battered uncle and told him to wait 20 minutes. And with that, the brothers disappeared into the night. Not to be outdone, Matthew Wedmore, the younger of the two brothers, made his own confession from Taunton jail just a few days before the trial. In it, he paints himself as the reluctant tag-along. According to Matthew, it was only Charles who came to see him drunk, muttering about the money their uncle kept in the house. 80 or 90 pounds, he said, and trying to rope him into the plan. Matthew claimed he initially refused, but by Wednesday night, after several quarts of drink at different public houses, he found himself at Dundry Hill, stick in hand. He admits to striking George Waterman repeatedly and dragging him upstairs, but shifts the responsibility for Sarah's death squarely onto Charles. The woman was sitting in a chair. My brother hit her on the head and struck her out of the chair. Later, it's Charles again who is framed as the dangerous one, waving pistols, ransacking drawers, eager to shoot. He was going to blow the old man's brains out, only I stopped him. And yet, when it came time to tie up their bleeding uncle in the milk house, Matthew did so himself, asking politely for a cord, as if this were part of a domestic chore. The confession ends with the two brothers stumbling back to Bristol, full of drink and bacon, still wearing blood-stained clothes, and dividing up the stolen watches. Both brothers had now confessed, and both blamed the other for the worst of it. This was the case for the prosecution. The jury, however, would soon be asked to decide whether either version truly mattered. But before a decision could be made, the defence presented their counter-argument. Mr. Speake, on behalf of the prisoners, contended that then charge of murder had not been legally established, and complained that the statements alleged to have been made by the prisoners had been withheld from the parties engaged for their defence. The jury must not rely on those statements except as far as it concerns the persons who made them. And putting aside those statements, he submitted that the evidence was not sufficiently clear to warrant a conviction. The judge's charge to the jury was brief, no more than 10 minutes, but unmistakably clear. If the brothers had gone out that night intending to rob, and with the expectation of using force should any resistance arise, then both were equally guilty of murder, regardless of who delivered the fatal blow. The only real question his lordship observed was whether the jury believed the evidence. As for the confessions, those, he said, were relevant only as testimony against the men who made them, but they hardly mattered. The Crown case, he told the jury, was already so perfect and complete that little more need to be said. He spoke with particular approval of George Waterman's testimony, a man, he said, who had given one of the most correct pieces of evidence ever delivered in a court of justice, not least because it aligned so precisely with the confessions of both accused. The jury then consulted amidst a breathless silence, and after about 2 minutes' deliberation pronounced both prisoners guilty of wilful murder. The clerk of arraigns, having put the customary questions to the prisoners as to whether they had anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon them, to which they made no reply. The learned judge, assuming the black cap and with deep emotion, proceeded to pass sentence upon them. He said they had been found guilty upon the clearest of evidence, and that could possibly be adduced in a court of justice, of a most barbarous murder on an old woman who had given them no offence. They had committed the crime two in the course of a robbery where this was not the least occasion for violence, as neither of those aged persons could have offered them much resistance. A more wanton or barbarous murder had never been committed, and though the prisoners each made statements admitting their guilt to a certain extent, it was quite right that so serious a matter should be tried and thoroughly investigated. It could not possibly have entered into the imagination of any person who had heard the trial that it could have had any other result than which had been arrived at. The two prisoners, who looked very pale and much thinner than when they were arrested, preserved a stolid indifference to what was passing around them throughout the trial, which lasted 4 hours and a half. They held no communication one with the other whilst in court, and were doubtless surprised to find, as the trial proceeded, that each had made a statement throwing the crime upon the other. The court, as well as all the avenues leading to it, was densely crowded during the trial, whilst in the exterior a large mob was assembled at the door leading to the gallery, where they remained throughout the day, in the vain hope of gaining admission. There were a large number of ladies upon the magistrate's bench, many of whom were moved to tears at the impressive manner in which his lordship passed the extreme penalty of the law. Both brothers, Charles and Matthew Wedmore, were found guilty of the wilful murder of their aunt Sarah Waterman. No recommendation for mercy was made, no commutation was granted. The law, in all its cold resolve, proceeded without hesitation, and so it was that on the morning of Friday the 5th of April, 1861, under the hands of the hangman William Calcraft, the sentence of death was publicly carried out upon the two men. Whatever doubts may have lingered in the society about the spectacle of public executions, there was little ambiguity here. Few, even amongst the most hardened abolitionists, could argue that if any crime merited the full and fearful weight of the law, this one did. From the Bristol Mercury of the 6th of April, 1861, the execution of Charles and Matthew Wedmore for the wilful murder of Sarah Waterman. Yesterday, the terrible sentence which the policy of our law has assigned to those who wilfully and of their malice and aforethought take the life of a fellow creature was carried into effect at Taunton upon Matthew and Charles Wedmore, the two brothers who were found guilty before Baron Martin at the last Somerset County Assizes of having, on the 9th of January last, murdered their aged aunt, Sarah Waterman, at Dundry. Whatever difference of opinion may be entertained as to the utility of public executions, even as to the justification of death punishments, there are few but must admit that if any case the dreadful punishment is deserved, it must be in such as one as this, for which these men have suffered. At precisely 7 minutes past 8 on the morning of April the 5th, 1861, justice was carried out on the gallows at Taunton. The crowd had gathered numbered somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000, many drawn from the neighbourhood towns and villages, some from Bristol itself, all eager to witness the final act in a crime that had horrified the West Country. William Calcraft, the most infamous executioner in Britain, had arrived the night before. By morning he stood ready at the scaffold. Both brothers were said to ascend the steps with unfaltering tread. As Matthew was being prepared first, Charles turned to watch, just for a moment, before lifting his face to the sky and then quietly bidding the chief warder goodbye. The drop fell, a dull thud sound, a gasp from the crowd. Charles's legs twitched briefly. Matthew, by contrast, hung motionless, but for the inevitable sway of the cord. It was, by all accounts, a clean job. And so the tale of Sarah Waterman's murder came to its grim conclusion. 2 nooses, 2 brothers, and a crime that shocked even a public well versed in Victorian brutality. What began as a cowardly scheme for a pensioner's savings ended with the gallows at Taunton under the practised hands of Calcraft. Justice in the eyes of 8,000 onlookers had been served, though not without a chill that lingered long after the bodies stopped swinging. Further particulars. Tonight's further particulars takes us up to Broughty Ferry in 1867, where a mysterious figure in rubber trousers and a devil's turnip lantern terrorised the locals with acrobatic leaps and suspicious clattering. Known only as Springlegs, this spectral prankster was part ghost, part gymnast, and part very confused prop technician. He fled the scene shouting "Chick, chick," which is either a terrifying curse or a poultry-based cry for help. Either way, the people of Broughty were not amused, and one of them had a flower pot to prove it. From the Dundee Courier, the 1st of February 1867, Springlegs in Broughton Ferry. Sir, our village of Broughty Ferry has been in great states of excitement during this week at the nightly appearance of Springlegs. Carnoustie has of late become too hot for him, and so he tries his little game on here. If he meets with better success than he met with last night, he will find it rather hot work. I would caution everyone to carry a pistol with him who has cause to be out at a late hour. If he comes in track again, he will play at ghostly no more, for 'tis certain a bullet goes through his head next time I confront him. On Tuesday night, at about 11:30, I was on my way home, proceeding along Brook Street, when, to my great surprise, I saw a tall object dressed in white approaching in my direction. Its pace was very rapid, and it seemed to move in a series of leaps, highly fantastic and unnatural. For a moment I believed my senses had deceived me, and my first instinct was to run, but drawn forward by an influence I could not overcome, similar to that experienced by birds when brought under the gaze of serpents, I found myself within 50 paces of it, when all of a sudden I heard a clattering noise resembling the emptying of a basket of wooden clothes pins, accompanied by a devilish chick chick, amidst which the nocturnal Springlegs vanished upper close. Determined to find out the cause of all this, I proceeded by the back of Urquhart Foundry and into a neighbouring garden, where, sure enough, there sat Springlegs, busily at work under a gooseberry bush, attempting to wrap a piece of twine around the broken leg of some sort of carte de visite stand. Thought I, that we'll see who moves out of here first. Springlegs now rose and placed his apparatus opposite a window, the blinds of which were drawn up. A cold shudder ran through me as he proceeded to draw from his breast pocket an article resembling a carving knife, but which turned out to be a candle. He immediately struck a match and applied a light, encasing the candle in a small box placed at the top of the 3-legged stand. It was comforting amidst the surrounding death-like silence to hear the sharp scratch of the match, which in ordinary circumstances would go unheeded, but which at that moment offered the same sense of feeling which a living object, such as a cat or a dog, would give in a house disturbed by some casual circumstances outside. From that moment I saw he was no devil, no ghost, no nothing but an ordinary human, maybe possessed of the devil, but without a devil's tail or the ability of lightening the candle by spitting fire. At this moment I let fly a large brick at his machine and immediately took to my heels, but on looking back I found myself hotly pursued. I ran in the direction of Stuart's nursery and found by the time when I was within near approach of that place that Springlegs was gaining fast upon me. I was too excited to cry for help, and rushing into the nursery I seized hold of a flower pot and by a well-directed aim laid poor Springlegs low just as he was entering the grounds. His moanings were dreadful, and at that moment I felt as a murderer would feel, but suddenly he gave over meaning and a sort of gurgling sound in his throat, and he made me believe he was dead. I undid his ghastly apparel made of a sort of rubber, and I found a young man of goodly proportions. His nose bled profusely, and the blood mixing with the hair on his face made him present a strange appearance. I proceeded to alarm the inmates of the nursery, but had not gone above 100 yards when I received the great shock of all that evening. Guess my surprise to find Springlegs running as fast as his legs would carry him towards the north of the grounds, crying, "Chick, chick!" I felt in no humour to follow him up. The fellow had evidently shammed death. Without disturbing anybody, I left for the scene of our first meeting and found a candle burning inside a turnip, with holes cut out in front resembling a devil's head, such as boys use on Halloween. The man's intention, I suppose, was to knock at the window and frighten the inmates inside, although what pleasure he could perceive in doing this, or in running about as I found him, seems a mystery. If you've enjoyed this descent into historical darkness, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, assuming, of course, that you haven't already. And if you haven't, why not? It costs nothing. It mildly appeases the YouTube algorithm, and it tells the system that we're worth burdening other unsuspecting viewers with. Some say that clicking like awakens the algorithmic spirits in the mist. Others whisper of a hype button seen only by those who view on phones and possess true intent. So do your part. Feed the algorithm, and remember, out here in the fog, the cloaked figure is always watching. And if you've an appetite for more historical crime, the kind that comes fully dressed in arsenic, fog and family betrayal, then you'll find over 730 episodes waiting for you on Patreon. For the mere sum of £5 a month, you get full access to the complete News of the Times archive, daily episode drops and 3 exclusive each week found nowhere else. And for the suspiciously minded, there's even a free 1-week trial. No contracts, no secret societies, just Victorian murder in its finest narrative attire. Find us at patreon.com/News of the Times, where the past never quite rests in peace. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, retired corpse hair braider, assistant librarian to the League of Unrepentant Poisoners, and the occasional goose wrangler for the Taunton Paranormal Society. We'll be back before the ink dries on the next confession.